Good evening and welcome to Inside the Rookery Season 8, Episode 14, where we are welcoming back feathered friend Adrian Tchaikovsky to talk about Shattering Faith. Welcome to the stream, Adrian. A real pleasure to have you back on the stream, and I know a lot of our viewers are really excited that you have returned.
Thank you very much.
No problem at all. So, today I am joined by my fellow Rook, Andy Leask, and we are going to be talking about faiths in fantasy novel series. So, let's jump straight into the questions. And Andy has asked, that's Andy right next to me, can you tell us about the Tyrant Philosophers series and the forthcoming Days of Shattered Faith to get us started off?
Yes, so this is my current fantasy series. It's planned to run to about 5 books, and one of the things that I'm trying to do is make each book independently readable. It starts with City of Last Chances, then House of Open Wounds, then this one, and they are all following the rise and fall of Palisand, which is a ruthlessly ideological and emphatically non-religious state, as it rampages over the world, being unpleasantly colonial, occupying cities, taking over places, and rendering gods down for their magic, because magic is what powers Palisand, and gods are a very good source of it.
Interesting. So,
just to jump on that. So, the first book was set in an occupied city, the second one in an army camp. The third book that's coming out very shortly, Days of Shattered Faith, is looking at diplomacy and soft power, as regards which is a topic that doesn't get aired that much in fantasy. So the main character is a diplomat, and it's looking at this. It's very much based on the way that European colonial powers behaved themselves when kind of getting their feet under the table of states they had an interest in.
Have you been watching or consuming any media in anticipation of that? We had Jendia Gammon on a few weeks ago, and she was talking about the series The Diplomat, which is a modern day diplomatic series, which we all very much love. Most of our guests and at the Rookery, because it's an excellent examination of, albeit a little bit more dramatic than it would be in real life, but still an interesting exploration of soft power and a diplomat in the UK, which is supposed to be kind of a prestige appointment, but not a real diplomatic appointment.
So for me, my big kind of sources have been historical podcasts, very specifically Mike Duncan's Revolutions podcast, which has inspired the whole series to a greater and lesser extent, because it's looking at, from the English Civil War through to the Russian Revolution, pretty much every major revolution in the world, and frequently why they fail, or why they get horribly taken over by the worst kind of people. And that very much informed City of Last Chances. More recently, the Empire podcast with Anita Arnon and William Dalrymple has been an enormously useful exploration of how 18th and 19th century European powers sort of conducted themselves. And because we tend to think of, you send the army in and take over a place, but that's almost never how it goes. Mm-hmm. Usually there is this insidious campaign to kind of destabilize and to set neighbor against neighbor, and to get in with certain people who will then benefit if you do take over. And so there is all of this going on to kind of soften up before you really kind of run the flag up the palace flagpole.
I think we also, in the 21st century, probably have a really nation-state, borders very clearly defined national identities view of these revolutions. I've been watching The Great as well recently, and one thing that jumps out there is they've really simplified it for the TV show. But actually, Peter wasn't born in Russia, he's German, Catherine's German, and they're talking about Russia as a national identity, but most of the royal families of Europe were interchangeable in some ways. And so they use those national identities. Yeah, certainly interrelated, but not as, looking back from now, nationalists use, Peter the Great, Catherine the Great as examples of amazing Russian leaders who were actually, it turns out, born in, I don't know, Prussia or Bavaria or somewhere.
Well, this is also it's something that tends to turn up a lot in genre fiction. The idea that national born boundaries are kind of ironclad and cultural boundaries are impermeable, and cultures are also basically monocultures. So if you have this group of people, these are the people who do this, and this is what they believe, and so forth, and all of them are basically like that. And it's a thing, it's a role-playing game thing, and it's a fantasy fiction thing, and it is problematic on a variety of levels, but also it tends to make for fairly, it's like the bigger Lego block size of worlds, really. It makes for this very kind of simple primary color sort of clash. Well, these are the good guys and these are the bad guys, and these are the guys getting caught in between. And one of the things I'm trying to do, although I'm telling a story where there is obviously a main bad guy, which are the Palestine, I'm trying to make everyone and everything in it as nuanced as possible, because I'm trying to produce that kind of real feeling tapestry of lots of real people just sort of clashing and butting heads and trying to encompass their own little personal ends. And then these are the grains of sand, and you see the landslide going on in the background.
Yeah, and it's interesting, therefore, that we're talking about faith and religion, because when I think about, the experience of watching The Great, and if I think about, the history of the United Kingdom's monarchies, a lot of time the distinguishing factor. So when Catherine goes from Prussia to Russia, what she experiences the strength of the Orthodox Church, and that's what the distinguishing characteristic is between home, which is in Prussia, and Russia, and that's the thing that she has to change to adapt to become Russian. It's not her language and it's not her previous culture, it's her religion. So I'm really interested to hear how that plays into your view of diplomacy and soft power.
So yes, I mean, obviously there is this slightly odd twist in this case, in that the major imperial power in the books is emphatically non-religious, although we do find out they had a god who was sufficiently ruinously expensive to them in terms of kind of sacrifice power and indeed sacrifice people and treasure and so forth, that they basically decided to get rid of them. And that was when they became the Palestine. And the other thing is, even though they're the bad guys, you work out a lot of the religions in this world are also not terribly nice. And whilst the Palestine stereotype of every religion is a bunch of maniacs with knives sacrificing people on the full moon is not universally true, it's certainly true in some cases. The way that the way that religion kind of plays in, and you do see this especially in the new book, is religion obviously is one of the main sources of sort of cultural identity. So in the nation of Uzmai, where most of the book takes place, that is, they have in fact a whole series of religions, because again, religions are complicated, and we tend to think of, well, this country has this religion. But that is by no means a universal thing, and frequently you get multiple religions with this slightly jockeying arrangement of just who does what and who is the dominant religion. So here there is a national religion of Uzmai, but there is also the religion that the old empire had that sort of fell ages ago, which is kind of clinging on and has become almost like a civil service, because when the empire fell, they were the people who could still read and write. And so you get all this weird fossilized tradition. This is what I mean about trying to make things as nuanced as possible, so that it's not that you turn up in Uzmai and yes, Uzmai has this god and that is what they do. It's just like, actually they have a load of gods, and all the gods have different orders of monks, and then they have weird traditions that have come in from elsewhere and all that sort of thing. And this is this fantastic mixing pot, none of which, of course, the Palestine have any patience for. And because the Palestine have their particular approach, they also don't really appreciate a lot of the nuance, and can make themselves extremely unpopular extremely quickly, because they have zero tolerance for other people's sort of beliefs and traditions.
So here, this is a good point to say hello to everyone in the chat. As always, we've had questions pre-submitted on Discord from our patrons and our lovely Discord community. But if you do have any questions and you're watching live, pop them in the chat and I will bring them up, as I have done with this one from Schmidt. I haven't gotten to the series yet, sorry, says Schmidt, but are the gods real / interacting with mortals in Shattering faith?
Yes, and in fact, they exist physically in the world as well. I mean, so the first people you meet in the first book, you meet Yasnik, and Yasnik is the last priest of God, and in fact, he lives with God in a tiny garret room, and goes out begging for scraps so he can sacrifice his spare shirts to God to keep God warm, because he is the last worshipper of God as well, and he and God are literally all each of them have got. But the gods exist, and the more they are worshipped, the more powerful they are, and they can rise and they can fall. And you see a lot about what happens to gods who are sort of on their uppers, and you see more powerful faith, and you hear at least stories of the Palatine going head to head with extremely powerful gods and cults and just overcoming them by sheer sort of ruthless military force.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, they're not only real, they are physically present, and which is of course why you can take them and hook them up to your batteries and drain them of all their power.
So we've talked a little bit about the inspiration for the whole kind of milieu that this is set in, but Sue Edgen has asked, can you talk a little bit about your inspirations behind the Palatine sway, specifically in terms of philosophy, etc.?
Yeah, so they're coming from a couple of different places. The general model of how they throw their weight around in the world is a lot like the big kind of 19th century European powers. I mean, the big inspiration for all of this kind of came from the Revolutions podcast, talking about the 1848 revolutions, when you have a lot of the parts of the various European empires trying to get their cultural independence, and one of the ways they're doing this is by finding what's left of their culture and reasserting it with kind of, there are songs, there are plays, there are stories, there's art, there's kind of a lot of nations kind of reinvent their own heritage at around that point. And all of these revolutions go completely to crap, I should say, and it's a fascinating point in history, because the whole history of Europe could have been completely upended in that 1 year, but all of them fail. Which is rather disappointing from a certain point of view. But the other thing is, because they are atheistic, you get a lot of that idea of a dominant oppressive power which has an extremely ideological bent as to how the world needs to be. And so you have a bit of Soviet Russia in there, and you have that kind, I mean, and you have that idea of, well, this, you can kind of tell that a lot of what they believe is perfection is completely made up, and probably quite deliberately made up, because of the whole Palatine state was intentionally created out of the people they used to be. But now this is what they do, and you've got to use their weight measures, and you've got to have their calendar, and you've got to use their money and speak their language and all of that sort of stuff. And it's the idea that, I mean, the really terrifying idea happening right now in the real world of a bunch of people who literally believe utter mad fictions having the power to impose those fictions on everyone else.
Mm-hmm. I feel a little bit like atheism is the ultimate opposite of populism. Like populism saying what people want to hear, want to believe, is easy to believe, and atheism's kind of the utter opposite. If you think humans don't want to die, atheism's kind of saying, and after you die, that's it. Like, this is your time is now. And I find that quite interesting, that some of the biggest revolutions, like if you think about the Russian Revolution, was grounded in that atheism and anti-church feeling, and was it therefore doomed to failure? I don't know.
I think that there's a lot of religion is inherently conservative, because the whole idea is religions are based on certain precepts that are set down by an external power, and frequently set down by an external power some considerable time ago. And there aren't that many religions that encourage you to examine those precepts very carefully and pick holes in them. So religion and revolution obviously do go hand in hand at various points in time, but I do, to me, it seems that as soon as a religion gains a certain amount of momentum and power, it becomes a bit of an anchor on social change rather than a driver of it. But that's just me. I mean, I am by no means an expert on this topic.
Yeah. So there's a few comments. So Richard says the Yasnik God dynamic is amazing.
It's a lot of fun to write.
Yeah.
Mark says Yasnik God relationship sounds akin to Brutha/Om in Small Gods. Mark hasn't read the Shattering Faith series, so just going on the chat. But there is a question about Yasnik and Om, which I will come to after I go to Andy, because I think he wanted to say something. And in the meantime, I'll flash this up. Malazan spoilers coming up.
Yeah. All I wanted to point out was that Richard in the chat is Swedgen, who submitted the topics, just so that's the something about that. But what I will say, I mean, that was fascinating. I actually quite enjoyed just listening to you two talk. Actually, I was part of the audience there for that. But particularly in the first book, the moment when the students kind of try and rise up against the Palestinians with the kind of barricades and everything, like it's interesting because when I was reading that, it felt to me like shades of maybe the French Revolution, but coupled with very much that sort of Soviet kind of oppressive. So it's interesting here that those were in the melange for your kind of inspirations.
I mean, it is also I kind of love the whole barricades bit in Les Mis.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a huge Victor Hugo fan. I mean, and this I've wanted to do fantasy Les Mis for decades, frankly, and this is my City of Last Chances specifically is my best shot at that.
Yeah.
So yes, I mean, I am an absolute sucker for the kind of the doomed uprising as a narrative sequence. So
yeah, and it was lovely, and it was exactly that thing that you were saying about I liked your metaphor, the grains of sand versus the kind of avalanche, that you had a whole bunch of individuals like almost like trapped in a role where they had to follow through what they almost knew wasn't going to succeed, but they had no choice but to see that through because of the weight of what was behind them. It's like good. It's almost like in a tragedy, when you know the ending's coming with that dramatic irony, you're invested even though you know it's going to end badly. It felt like that. So, yeah.
Oh, Richard said, Richard said, yes, City of Last Chances reminded me so much of the writing style of Les Mis. I saw a meme the other day that said, have you ever had a piece of bread so good that you understand the whole plot of Les Mis? And I was a bit like, you kind and I was like, any piece of bread is that good if you're hungry and you have no bread, like way to miss the point of Les Mis.
Yeah, but I mean, also speaking to somebody who now only has access to gluten-free bread, which is generally significantly inferior to proper bread. Like I definitely do get it more now. I do,
and more expensive as well.
Yeah, if it was,
you do another 5 years if it was gluten-free.
Yeah. Yeah, if it was a good gluten-free donut that tasted like an actual proper donut, like I would be overthrowing the government and out straight away. Like, yeah.
Right, so the Malazan spoilers, let us go to that question. Suajin asked, I see parallels and contrasts between Yasnik and God in City of Lost Chances and Tehal and Bug in Malazan. Was that intentional, and are you a fan of Erikson?
So I am a fan of Erikson, but I've read most of the Malazan books quite a while ago when there were only 9 of them out. Since when not only has the 10th come out, but a lot of the other associated material. There is so much of it now that at some point I need to go back and actually go through all of it from the beginning. When for some reason I have like an entire year of reading I need to fill. I wasn't intentionally basing Yasnik and God on them, but obviously I have read those books, so it all goes into the mix, and quite possibly there is some inspiration subconsciously working there. I think the main, because we had a bit of a chat about this beforehand, I think the main difference is that Yasnik basically almost never accomplishes anything worthwhile, whereas the other characters I think have a reasonable amount of agency in their relevant book. So.
Yeah, and it definitely is a much more reciprocal relationship. There's a lot of give and take there, and a sort of sense of mutual respect between the two, which I think is lacking.
Yeah, I think I'm with you, Adrian.
I'm
with you, Adrian. I've read, I think, maybe 4 or 5 of the Malazan books, and it was long enough ago now that I am going to have to go back and reread them all over again. I'm quite excited to do that because I know there's some characters in those books that were a big inspiration for Andy Law, so it'll be really interesting to go back and reread, especially the first book, Whiskey Jack's Bridge Burners, and see how different, how divergent now the inspiration that Andy got from them are, and what they were like originally. So I'm quite excited to go back. I've been a bit, I don't know if anyone else is like this in the chat, but I haven't read as much in the last, something about the COVID era stopped me reading, and I'm just getting back into like physical, actual reading of books. So maybe now's the time for me to go back.
Yeah. My problem is, and I've whinged about this before, but just being an English teacher, I keep having to take the things I want to read and put them to one side for the things I have to read. And like I've got advanced higher pupils doing dissertations just now, and it's much easier to mark a dissertation if you know. And the ones that are sticking to the classics, or like Ian Banks or Gray McRae Burnett, or like authors that I'm reading anyway, fine. But like I love Virginia Woolf. One of my students is doing Jacob's Room, which I had never read, and I'm like, oh well, great! I get to read a new Virginia Woolf, but I have to read it right now because I cannot understand what she's saying until I've read that.
So just a big up for Andy Leask, who's an English teacher. So he recommended, what book did you recommend to one of my daughters? Well, you recommended both their dissertation books.
Yeah. Oh God, I can't remember what Josie's one was.
I can remember. It was Never Let Me Go. And
yes, that's right.
Yep, she delved really deep into the meaning of the song and the multiple layers of meaning, and she got a very good mark for her dissertation, thanks to Andy Lee's support and feedback. And although Andy, only because of timing issues, you recommended the book for Laurie, my younger one, she also got an extremely good mark in her dissertation. So I can highly recommend Andy Lee's recommendations for English books if your child is doing advanced higher with him.
Yeah, and this is my beautiful Folio Society edition of it. It's The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay by Michael Shea Bond, which I have spoken about before on streams. That was what I recommended to.
That's a fantastic book.
Because she needed something obviously literary for advanced higher, but she's a big fan of like like comics and anime and stuff like that. So it felt like a natural fit. Yeah.
Indeed. And I have an anecdote about the process of writing that dissertation, which we will save for another time, regarding ChatGPT and its hallucinations. So I love this comment, Carrie. So happy that you've joined us. So my mom, Linda, just turned 76, and this is her first fantasy series read. Isn't that brilliant? She loves it, and she asks, how do you come up with the characters' names? So Carrie's mom, Linda, this one's for you.
So two-part process really. Each of a character's origins are going to play into their name. So each characters who come from Ilmar and that country are going to have a certain type of name, which is kind of has a bit of a Slavic feel to it. The Palatine all tend to have vaguely British sounding names. So that there's that, and then beyond that, there's a real gut feeling to what sort of name, what kind of the long and short vowels and the sounds that give a sense of the character. So ideally, the name fits the character, which, that's just sort of, that's narratively quite pleasant, but also it does mean that when the character turns up 7 chapters later, there's a greater chance of people remembering, oh, that's that character, because the name kind of gives a little bit of it, has a feel to it. Although possibly that literally only worked to me. I don't know whether that necessarily works for everyone, but that's how the name comes out. It's like there's a mold, and then precisely what I pour into the mold is the character's own peculiarities.
Yeah, I'd be really interested to hear from people in the chat if they feel that it's almost an onomatopoeia effect of what the character's like and what the name is. So do people in the chat who've read the series feel like that? I'm like, Yasnik. Like, how does that, the onomatopoeia of the word and the character?
And it is funny, isn't it, that there is, because this is something like from an RPG perspective, Lindsay and I have spoken about this before, that our much as we love actually role-playing and actually playing the games, by far the best bit is making characters. And particularly for Warhammer Fantasy roleplay, because you can roll on the table, it's all randomized, and then you make a story out of what you get there. But there is something when it comes to those names that you'll look them up and you'll be looking for the etymology and be like, oh, the meaning's right, but it just doesn't sound right. The poetry isn't there in the name, and you need to keep iterating it until you get it exactly right.
Yeah, there was a new character introduced last night on our Lawhammer stream, and that name just had come to me. I find the best ones are the ones that just like arrive in your head in the moment, the characters and the names, almost like you didn't make them yourself, like they've just been born there. And that's what that name, Tanavin, that name just sort of arrived in my mind, and it just felt like exactly right for the character that I wanted to create. Have you ever, Adrian, like changed had a name and then been like, no, actually that's not right, and then had to like fix your manuscript?
The only time I generally have to tinker with names post facto is when I realize two names are too close together.
Yeah.
There are too many names with starting with a particular letter or something. For some reason, I'm a martyr to having characters starting with the letter S, so I usually have to try and steer myself away from that. But it's usually once the name is there, that is how I am generally thinking of the character.
Yeah,
it gets much more complicated in this series because you do have characters who skip between the books, and they usually turn up with a different name whenever you see them. So, I mean, Yasnik is there's a scene at the beginning of the second book where Yasnik turns up having been drafted into the army, and the person he's introducing himself to isn't listening, and so they basically just call him Jack. Yeah, and also he's got a strong Marek accent, and they don't really understand what he's saying a lot of the time. So he's just Marek Jack for the entire book, and he kind of that becomes the name he actually adopts himself, because actually, getting away from the person he used to be becomes a bit of a benefit to him.
Yeah. And you're in good company in terms of names. I regularly, or rather my students regularly lament how much Shakespeare does that in terms of having characters with similar names. So Edgar and Edmund in Lear, and it's probably deliberate there because there's parallels, it's so confusing. Or basically all of the characters that aren't Prospero, Ariel or Caliban, all of the ones who come to the island in the Tempest. I can't remember which one's the Duke, which one he's his brother, and he's his brother. And they're just,
I think it's particularly difficult if you're studying Old English and you're studying that kind of Wessex Marcia era of the kingdoms, and they're all named Ethan, Alfred, Alphalon, everything. Yeah. The wives are the same, and they're just so similar. I find it really difficult to pick apart my Aethelred the unready from I don't know, Aethelred the fully counseled right now. Yeah. So let's have a look. Suejin had a little follow-up to that Malazan one, which was, and continues, and are there any other fantasy inspirations for your presentation of the divine that you wanted to?
So to a certain extent, there were some sort of tropes I was trying to get away from. For direct inspirations, this was not, I swear, in my head when I was writing it intentionally, but looking back on it, I can see it's still been a huge subconscious inspiration. It's been mentioned already, which is of course Small Gods, and the it's not the same story as Small Gods, especially because obviously it's not an Inquisition that is the main opposition, the bad guys in the series, but there's definitely an element of looking at gods in that kind of way, in that kind of practical way, because Pratchett was very, very good at looking at fantastical, the practical ramifications of fantastical elements. He was one of the best for that. I mean, weirdly, there's been a book I've read recently, which I'm kind of glad I hadn't read before starting the series, because I think it would have been too much of an influence, which is Anne Leckie's The Raven Tower, which also has a lot to say about gods in a fantasy world in an absolutely fascinating way.
So Jamie,
that's one of those books. I'm talking about those books I have that I want to read, but that is one that's literally sitting on my to read pile.
Strongly recommended. I've never come across anything quite like it as far as looking at gods in a fantasy world.
Excellent.
That shall go on my to read list as well. Do you have it, Andy? Can I borrow it, or have you not?
Yes, but not until I've read it.
Yeah, but you're not going to read it for ages, so I can read it first and read it for you.
That is true. We'll negotiate off stream.
Yeah, we'll negotiate. So Jamie asks, I'd be interested in your thoughts about non-believers and non-worshippers of gods in a fantasy world where the gods absolutely exist without doubt. Not denial that the gods exist, but believing that none of the gods are truly divine beings, or that their proven failure to help everyone proves their lack of true divinity. I'll go back to the first half, so you've got that there.
Yes, I mean, so this is a lot of this works fairly naturally in the setting because of the physicality of the gods, and because of essentially the provinciality of the gods. So gods tend to have a place, and they have a particular body of worshippers, and they'll have a temple, and the power of the gods will be linked to certain sort of regions, which kind of makes them fair game. And it's a bit like I think it's Schwarzenegger in Predator, whereas if it bleeds, you can kill it.
Yeah.
And that kind of becomes the Palestine view. And the thing is, gods are a particular thing in this world, but they are also part of a larger, the dread word is, of course, magic system. But there are particular sort of ways the world works as regards power and as regards magic, and there are ghosts and there are demons and there are gods and various other things, and all of these things they're not individual isolated, just in the way we're talking about the permeability of borders. You can see how ghosts work in this particular way, but the wards that keep ghosts into the House of Hard Angles in in Days of Shattered Faith will also keep demons in, and so the analytical minds who do magic in this world can look at there is obviously something common going in, and the fact that those wards don't keep people in show that there is something that happens to you that changes you fundamentally when you die, because your ghost is kept in when you're living. The living spirit of you is not. And so, this is very much an Age of Reason sort of narrative where people are looking at these things. And of course, when you're looking at that in that way, you think, all right, gods, are they all that really? Or are they just a really big repository of magical power attached to some sort of will? And if the latter, then you can absolutely just use them as a resource.
Yeah,
I find that go, Andy.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, I did when I was at uni, I did obviously English Lit, and one of the honors courses that I did in it was called The Disenchanted World, and it was sort of specifically looking at, because I'd done another one that was about the English Civil War, and like I said, it was specifically the period of like the Restoration era through to like the beginning of the next century, so like post-Renaissance but pre-Enlightenment, and it was this idea of disenchantment was the concept we looked at, the idea that people had moved past magical thinking, had moved past the idea that things just happened, but they hadn't worked out how they happened. They'd worked out that there was a way to work out how they happened, but they hadn't worked out what that way was. So like almost pre-scientific process, the dawn of all the stuff that Invisible College book is about. So like Hook and Newton, all those people.
That's the thing. Mystical. It seems to me that a lot of what we think of as mystical thinking is an incredibly modern phenomenon. The idea that magic has to be mystical, and that if you can understand how it works, then that's not anything to do with how magic, and that's not how you should be thinking about magic. When if you look at the way that people are approaching these things in the Middle Ages, or indeed frequently in classical times, they're approaching it with just the same level of analysis as we do science, but they're frequently starting from rather skewed. Obviously, if you are a scholar in the 13 or 1400s, you are trying to work out how the world works in just the same analytical way. But the problem is you're starting from the point of view of, well, actually, God makes all of this stuff happen. But you're still working out, well, how can I make that work for me? If what about alchemy? What about summoning angels to tell me where treasure is, or all that sort of thing? And in the same way, if you go back to, I think it's ancient Babylon, there's this enormous library of, I think, like wooden livers, which is basically a divinatory library of, well, if your animal's liver looks like this, then this is what it means. And no one goes to that level of detail if they're assuming, well, it's just a bit woo, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I think it's innately human and it's only now that we have science a scientific methodology that explains how the world works that people are going back to, oh well, astrology, it's all a bit woo.
Yeah, I don't want to malign my tutor. I would say it was less about the process; it was more about the like the morality and the meaning behind it, if that makes sense. So it was looking at through that birth of like material rationalism and the lack of a belief in God as a moral absolute that was underpinning. So we were looking at examples of literature.
Yes, I mean, once you get out of the idea of, well, actually everything is a reflection of God, I mean, it's why you get all these very weird medieval bestiaries with saying, oh, yes, these animals do all these crazy things and they're symbolic of this, that, and the other. And the thing is, they're not actually really bestiaries trying to tell you about animals. They're trying to tell you about human morality. And so, everything, and because God made the world and he made the world for us, then everything in the world must be in some way a lesson for us. But that's they are working on that kind of basis because that the starter belief they've got is, well, God, and therefore everything has to come from that, which means you end up with some very peculiar conclusions sometimes.
I think you make a really good point, though, about so if you take alchemy as the example, and we look back and think, well, that was so ridiculous, alchemy, and they wanted to turn lead into gold, and clearly that's magical thinking, and that's not going to happen. But actually, a huge amount of scientific progress and understanding came from alchemists who were studying the properties of physical things. And then also, if you think about us in the future, if we find out in 300 years that like cold fusion just isn't possible, we'll look like those alchemists. Or if we come up with a way to travel faster than light, we won't look like those alchemists. So I think it's a really like interesting point that you make around if you had a world where magic existed, it wouldn't really be called magic because it would just be science.
Well, going back to Pratchett, this is something that Pratchett does extremely well in that the idea that, but also, I mean, it's something I like to do with world building, just basically on the basis that the way people think about things is, if you've got a thing, if the world works in a certain way, and obviously, in a fantasy world, unlike in the Middle Ages, actually all this magic stuff genuinely does things. In that case, what is not going to happen is it just kind of gets kept under a bushel and only ever used by the Dark Lord to do things or whatever. Magic will be used to do whatever you can do with magic. And if there is a cost to magic, that will get factored in. And so this is why in City of Last Chances, you have factories, and the factories are driven by demons because you can summon demons and they're big and strong and they will do what you tell them if your contract is good enough. And so everything becomes demon powered. And then obviously you see in House of Open Wounds, the second book, you get to see how this gets experimented with in warfare. And what can you do with a ghost as an offensive weapon and that kind of thing.
Yeah, which I think is like way more real than quite a number of fantasy settings introduce a moral nature to gods and magic, because otherwise everyone would just use it and everyone would just have it in a way that they don't with swords. So if you think about, sorry.
No, I mean, think this is you kind of have to have some sort of cost balance thing for magic. Otherwise, yes, literally everyone is doing magic all the time, and it becomes this weird kind of fantastical post-scarcity thing, which would be an interesting setting to see. Honestly, I don't think I've seen that sort of thing, but although I suppose maybe you get to things like the Dance at the End of Time, Michael Moorcock, and that's kind of what you have there. Everyone just, if you can think of it, it can happen, and then everything except for your relationships with other people becomes basically trivial. But once you've got that limit in place, that's then what you can play with. And you say, well, all right, given that limit, what would people do with it? And, especially what would people do with it in sort of situations where you have a small number of extremely powerful people who can make stuff happen? It's a bit like, if you had a magical setup where you say, yes, obviously you can use blood magic to drain the life from children to prolong your own existence. That's obviously going to be happening. That's going to, every single nation is going to have an immortal aristocracy, and there will be a short supply of children, and that then becomes your setting, and that becomes the pressures and the drives for your plot. But it's if there is magic, if there is anything like that, it's going to get used. And it's frequently going to get used for very banal and mundane purposes, because those are the things that people want.
So Martin has asked, and this is sort of related and then off on a tangent. So in terms of religion, organized religion, I guess, as well as just people's faith in general, Martin asked, what replaces faith, i.e. belief without proof, when gods are real?
I mean, I guess two things. I mean, weirdly enough, of course, in a world where gods are real, then if your state is based on a kind of an anti-divine ideology, that is a weird kind of faith. And what the Palatine are driving across the world in their belief that everyone should do things their own perfect way, it is almost what we would see as a religious crusade, because it's based on this belief that has nothing underpinning it. But the fact they keep winning the battles, I guess. But also you get this thing that just because the god is real doesn't mean that stuff kind of doesn't accrue around them, in the same way that we have weird cults of celebrity in the real world, and that celebrity can be a real person. But that doesn't mean that people don't surround them with this weird sort of halo of how wonderful they are and what they believe they can do, and how they believe their personal relationship exists, that kind of parasocial thing, all of which is completely fictional, effectively, but it's still a very, very powerful driver of how people act and believe.
I think there would be quite an interesting, but the scarcity angle. So if you consider gods and demons as power and that as our equivalent to oil, what is the climate change when you start to consume those gods and demons, etc.? Like, what effect would that have on the natural world? Quite an interesting question.
Yeah, I mean, and there's certainly, I mean, the general setup in the book seems to be that magic slowly comes into the world and accumulates. But when you bring belief and adulation into it, you are then sort of concentrating that background radiation level of magic into these individual things, into objects, into entities, into places. I guess I haven't looked particularly at that kind of climate change angle, and maybe there isn't one in this case. Maybe they're very lucky in that world, or maybe the particular kind of industrial burning of magic has some sort of diminishing returns or decreasing problem. Maybe the magic is going out of the world quicker than you're bringing it in. The idea of kind of getting toxic magic residue is a very, very common sort of fantasy world trope, especially I certainly recall reading books where you got kind of like zones where you'd have big magical battles, which were basically no-go zones, and that would have been back in the 90s, so that's been going for a long time.
Yeah, I think there's a school of fantasy, isn't there? And we play Warhammer, and that is very much in that school that equates magic with radiation, and so you kind of left with a radioactive waste. And I do wonder whether that's the 80s and the 90s, whether that comes from that generation who grew up with the constant threat of the Cold War and of the constant fear of our world becoming that like nuclear winter radioactive hellscape.
I absolutely think it is. I mean, there are the number of books that just out and out reference nuclear war when it doesn't even necessarily fit in the narrative particularly, or where you get the kind of the twist at the end is, oh, actually this world is after a nuclear war and all the magic is weird sort of radiation driven psychic powers and things like that. And it's just like it's impossible to get away from in the fiction of the time. And certainly I think when people are writing about kind of magical fallout, they're very much thinking nuclear rather than just sort of chemical pollution.
Absolutely terrifying there that as you announced the nuclear war, you hit your microphone and we had kind of like a death knell.
Oh, sorry.
If you watch this back, it was like perfect timing. Dong. Yeah.
It's funny that like I was listening to, of all things, like a food podcast, off menu podcast yesterday, but they were talking about how when people are thinking about like their ideal food, they're often chasing either like a memory of something that they experienced that they want to relive, or like an idealized fictional version. And the example they were talking about was spaghetti and meatballs, and how for most people they first saw spaghetti meatballs in a cartoon before they ate it, and so the reality never lives up to what they saw in the cartoon. And I wondered if like to a certain extent, just thinking about, because you're right, like as soon as you pointed out like the trend of all these worlds where there was the revelation that it's actually post-apocalypse, it's actually this. Like, are they all just chasing the high of the end of the original Planet of the Apes? Is it all just trying to get back to that? You blew it up, is it? Because that nailed it, but I've not really seen any that have nailed it since then. But yeah.
So Mark McGee asks, what do you think are the biggest commonest pitfalls when creating a fictional religion?
So, and this I think this is more a thing that you tend to find in sort of older fantasy books, but it still turns up occasionally. But the biggest one is kind of transplanting a real world religion just in its entirety into your fantasy world. And you frequently see basically the Catholic Church with the serial numbers filed off, basically just turning up and it's the Catholic Church, and they're very down on witches, and they've got their inquisitors and all that sort of thing. And you kind of look at the world and you think there is nothing in this world that suggests you would really get a Catholic Church. And this is obviously a Catholic Church, and usually, it's an evil Catholic Church, and it's corrupt, and it's very keen on the money and all of that sort of thing. But it's still very recognizably kind of a late medieval Renaissance sort of church, just chunked in, rough edged into this. And sometimes it's just like, yes, these people are obviously Vikings, and they believe in in not particularly Viking stuff, but the kind of the 4 or 5 generations removed view of the Vikings as kind of jolly people who all want to die in battle and that kind of thing, or it's the kind of the howling dervishes from the desert or that kind of thing. And it's just, if you're going to do a religion, and the other thing is actually religion is not as common as you think in fantasy. It's certainly there, but a number of worlds get along without it, either explicitly or just there are vague folk beliefs and nothing else. But if you're having religions, at least think about where the religions come from and think about what knock-on effects you have. Because the other thing you tend to get is that the religion exists kind of in a weird hermetic isolation from the rest of the world. That it's just, yes, we're the church and you have to do what we tell you, but it's not like anyone really goes to church or anyone has any particular beliefs in what the religion thinks. It's just like they're almost, it's frequently the religions turn up more as a worldly and political force, with very, very vague, other than the things that they are down on, what the details of the religion are extremely nebulous, because they're there to be sort of oppressive and bad quite frequently. And no one has a holiday. It's remarkably, I mean, this is one of the things with Days of Shattered Faith. There is a calendar, there are holidays, there are traditions, there are things that religion. I mean, I should say, I'm doing this series as kind of a devil's advocate thing because I'm not personally religious in any way, and I do feel that religions have frequently done extremely bad things in real world history. But the other thing is religions are not a thing aside from everything else people do. And therefore religions will interact. So, the medieval church did crusades, but it also did kind of almshouses and looked after the poor and gave some sort of moral direction in that thing. These things are complicated. It's not just all sort of moustache twirling cardinals ordering assassins around, things like that.
Definitely. And I think just on that, one of the things we've spoken about as some writers of RPGs is obviously, we create the worlds and sort of the flat pack, IKEA version of the story for the games masters and players to put together. And it's really interesting, particularly in Warhammer, because that's the one we've written on, this one we live stream in our other endeavor. And within the Empire, which is sort of the main bit human sort of civilization that gets explored, like it is expressly polytheistic. There are all these different gods that have a real intangible kind of effect. They're not literally physically there, but they have a tangible effect on the world. They're believers, can enact miracles, so people know they're real. But there is one kind of dominant faith, the patron kind of god of the Empire, Sigmar, and it is interesting like Games Workshop definitely a little bit leaned on the fantasy Catholicism kind of in there. But then what's happened is players over decades of role playing have really steered into that. And when we were writing the 4th edition and we were really trying to get across the polytheistic thing, both in what we were writing and then interacting with people in social media and online, and really trying to get people to see that people just kept, there was a, and I suppose it's understandable, but there was a tend to revert to what they know from the real world to try and go.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in the Warhammer old world, you've got an extra influence there in that it is a fantasy 1600s Europe. So, and a lot of the other institutions you've got are kind of at least echoing a real world. So it's fairly natural that you've got a slope, and if you don't want the religion to end up going down that slope into sort of historical, either Catholicism or kind of wars of religion sort of thing, then you have to keep pushing it uphill.
Mm-hmm. So just while we're on the Warhammer, Henri asks, a plea to you, will you consider writing a sequel to Alien Clay? And P.S. Loved the Skaven. So will you consider writing a sequel to Alien Clay?
So, I mean, I never say never with sequels. Mm-hmm. At the moment, there is no plan to, and I don't have the idea to. So I'm just saying, make sure it doesn't lead out. The thing that would get me over the bump to write a sequel for Alien Clay was having an idea that was at least as interesting as the idea I had to write the first book. And the thing is, whilst there is an obvious sequel story about what happens when they get to Earth, I don't think that story would necessarily be as interesting as that first book. If I had an idea for it, I mean, basically, I would need a couple of really interesting twists as to what happens when the situation you've got at the end of Alien Clay, not to give any spoilers, gets to Earth, because the stock story I think wouldn't be worth writing the book on. But maybe that will come to me, and at that point, I may well do it. So
never say never is the answer.
Yeah. It also depends on how well the book has got to have done well enough that the publishers are keen on it on a sequel. I do occasionally try and push a sequel to a book that hasn't necessarily done that well, just because I really want to write it. But you can generally tell pretty quickly when the publishers aren't up for it.
So I'll just go back to this one, which I did flash up, but we never covered. So Martin asks, what properties make gods more than just superheroes or powerful wizards?
So, weirdly, I mean, certainly in this series, in the Tyrant Philosopher series, but also I'd say in the Raven Tower, and I think in a lot of other fantasy settings where there are actually gods which are genuinely there, because frequently one of the things I would say frequently you also get with religions in fantasy stories, there is no suggestion that the god is really there. It's written from a very modern perspective, and people, there's often little suggestion that people even believe the god is really there. It's just kind of going through the motions. But where the god is actually there and could theoretically stomp about being a superhero, what I think it is, tends to be more of an interconnection of responsibilities. I don't think gods tend to have the agency that superheroes or wizards or kind of fantasy novel protagonists have. They are frequently very limited in what they can do, so that the power they've got can only be channeled in certain ways, potentially can only be channeled through certain kind of vessels and vehicles. Gods tend to be kind of almost built over by the structure and logic of the world in a way that prohibits them kind of just storming about and doing things themselves. Because if you could storm about and do things yourselves, you wouldn't need to be a god, because you wouldn't need worshippers or religion or anything like that. The fact is, the gods are part of a system rather than being that kind of maverick agent.
Yeah, empowered by the system, but also constrained by the system.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting because I added Martin and us superheroes, and I added the powerful wizards parenthesis. I'm in the middle of playing Dragon Age Veilguard, the kind of new sort of Dragon Age game, and there's a specific bit in it because you're dealing with these ancient elven gods. I won't spoil the plot, there are some interesting twists about that. But there is a point when these gods have first risen, and your character's running around telling everybody these gods, these evil elven gods have arisen. We need to fight them. And people go, "Yeah, but are they gods? Are they just powerful wizards? Are they?" And it was I kind of wished the story had made a bit more of that, but it was nice that it was there, because
well, you do often get settings where you get things that are described as gods. I mean, but that are just very, very powerful and frequently sort of very, very alien entities. I mean, the whole sort of cosmic horror and cosmic horror adjacent fantasy going all the way from like the pulps in the 30s has an awful lot of that going on. So the things there, they have priests and they have worshippers, but actually they may not really be doing any god stuff. They're just there and very powerful, and you can throw someone into their lair to be devoured as a sacrifice.
Yeah, like there's a distinction in Marvel, isn't there, between like Thor and the gods and actual gods.
I think Marvel has about 19 different varieties of things that are called gods, and then there are the gods of the god and the things that created the universe, and then things are great. And it's just, I mean, Marvel, because it's basically been ongoing continuously for so many decades, the whole kind of Marvel cosmology is I don't know, potentially more complex than the real world's cosmology at this point.
Yeah. And I don't know. Yeah, I don't know what Kirby was smoking when he was writing a lot of it, but a lot of it does get up there.
So we've only got a few minutes left, so I've got a few sort of wrap up questions. And Andy, this was one of your questions, because we were talking last night when we were advertising the stream about how many books how quickly you write books. So where do you find the time to write all these excellent books? What's your secret?
I mean, I used to basically try and claim it was all an artifact of the publishing schedule, but I don't think I can get away with that anymore. Yes, I write an awful lot of books. I'm not entirely sure how I managed to get away with it, but I do, because of my old habits as a games master, I do an awful lot of world building before actually starting to write. Whether or not I plot a book, the world is always there, and it's always there in a reasonable amount of detail, which means that everything that goes into the book matches everything else if I've got that right, which means that the first draft of the book, while it may need to be cut a bit for length and so forth, doesn't need a lot of retconning or a lot of rewriting. And so I think that's where I save on the time, is that I generally don't need a second draft, because everything is already locking in quite nicely, because it's coming from that one central point of inspiration.
That's great. That's doubly great. That's great, because that's really interesting. That's also particularly great, again, English teacher gripes, when we very often get authors in to talk, and many lovely authors we've had on this podcast I've had into schools, including Anna James, who we've had on a couple of times, we're going to have on again next year, and she like you is the exception. But a lot of the time when authors come in, the first thing kids ask is about like planning, because obviously as teachers we get kids to plan, not necessarily plan out their plot methodically, but to do some planning before they start writing, so that they've thought about it. And the amount of authors that unhelpfully go, "Oh, I never plan. I just dive in and start writing." And I'm like,
but, I mean,
that's not what this 11-year-old needs to hear. This 11-year-old needs to hear, think a little bit before you start.
But I should absolutely say that I know writers who do that, and they write excellent books. Everyone has the difficult thing, I think, is finding out what the process is that works for you, and all I can speak to is the process that works for me.
Yeah,
absolutely.
But I think it was a good. What you said there was really useful. I'm going to try and find a way to incorporate it into my teaching with the kids, because when I try and talk to them about planning, they immediately go to plots. They immediately go to, well, this happens, or I don't want to plan the plot. And actually, what you're saying there about world building, having that sense of what's the sandbox, the playground in which you are going to write your story, like that I think is really helpful. So.
Well, I mean, I should say, whilst I normally plot this series, The Tyrant Philosophers, I'm creating the world and the characters, and then basically letting the pressures and friction that I've generated in that creation tell me what's going to happen. I'm just kind of following the characters around with a notebook with this, and that seems to work quite well.
That probably comes from your strengths as a GM, because a lot of the time a GM is thinking about what the PCs are doing, but also what a whole cast of characters are doing in the background. And Andy Law, our GM, has said he doesn't decide what a character will do. He knows what the world is, and the characters kind of operate in that world.
Yes, that's exactly it. Yeah.
Yeah. And then finally, we're almost at the very end of the stream. So very last question from Lazy Cat, which is, what are your future plans? What's coming next?
So, I mean, next in print after Days of Shattered Faith, I think February, March next year in the UK is Shroud, which is the standalone sci-fi book about getting stranded on a horrible, horrible alien planet. There's also a book, novella, The Hungry Gods, which is what happens when the billionaires come back from space to the world that they ruined. And then later on, there will be a book, I think we're calling it Bee Speaker, which is the third book in the Dogs of War series. That's all for next. That's all coming out next year.
I have also heard from Gendia, Gammon, and that you are going to be appearing in one of their anthologies. Andy,
yes, so I've had a number of short stories written this year, unusually for me, most of which I'm trying to make in the Tyrant Philosopher's universe where I possibly can, so that I can collect them later on and just have a bit of extra for that setting, because I'm loving writing in this setting enormously. But yes, they're the book she's got coming out called Of Stars and Sabers, I believe, and my story in that is not only, I think, one of the finest pieces of short fiction I've written, but also, if you ever wondered, well, what happened to Yasnik immediately after City of Last Chances, that is the story that tells you.
Oh, brilliant. Well, that's great, because as I said, Gendia was on a few weeks ago. Gareth and Gendia have both been on before, and we heard a lot about Stars and Sabers, so I am sure quite a few of our viewers will be picking that up, especially now they have heard that it will tell them more about Yasnik.
I'm very glad I've already crowdfunded it, so I guess so.
Yeah, I have crowdfunded it too. So one final question, because bless him, he's been in the chat all night. Does a map of the Tyrant Philosopher's world exist, please?
It doesn't. I may do one at some point, but each of the first story and the third story take place within specific locations, and there are maps of those locations. And the second story, it's a military story, and they travel about quite a lot, and you hear a lot of places mentioned, but the point is the people on the ground, like soldiers often are, have no clue what's going on or where they're being shipped out to, or the physical relationships with these places. So I didn't want to draw a map of it and fix it in my head, because I think I would have lost that element of just complete confusion amongst the characters.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Adrian, for joining us. As always, you've been a brilliant guest. Thank you to everyone in the chat, and thank you to all our Patreons who keep the ads off the stream, keep us ad free. So do check out our Patreon and join us again for another session of Inside the Rookery next week. Until then, I will say good night. Thank you once again to Adrian, to Andy, my fellow Rook, and see you all soon. Caw-caw, caw-caw.